What if I told you that the money in your pocket might one day be worthless? That's not some far-fetched scenario. It's a looming possibility tied to the way our financial system operates. In 2008, the world faced one of the worst financial crises in history. But was it truly resolved, or did we just push the problem down the road? In today's video on No Money, we'll dive deep into how money can lose its value, exploring the events of the past and what they mean for our future. Stick around to find out how this affects you and what you can do about it. The Unsettling Question.
In 2008, the world experienced one of the greatest financial turmoils in history. Markets around the world started crashing, and major financial institutions, once thought to be invincible, started showing signs of collapse. Governments responded quickly, issuing massive bailouts and stimulus packages in an effort to keep the world economy afloat. And it worked. The global economy recovered much quicker than most predicted, and soon it was back to business as usual.
In 2008, the global economy was rocked by a financial crisis that seemed to come out of nowhere. But was it really a surprise, or were there warning signs we chose to ignore? While governments stepped in with bailouts and stimulus packages, these actions didn't necessarily fix the problem. They just delayed it. Now, cracks are appearing again, and we need to understand how we got here to avoid an even bigger disaster. So, let's unravel the events that led to the financial meltdown of 2008 and explore what might lie ahead. The prelude to the crisis. The seeds of the 2008 crisis were planted years earlier, in the early 2000s. Back then, owning a home was the ultimate goal for many Americans. The housing market was booming, and everyone wanted a piece of the action. However, behind this rosy picture, there were some troubling practices going on. Banks began offering subprime mortgages, loans given to people who were unlikely to repay them. Why would they do this? Simply put, greed. More loans meant more profits, at least in the short term. But it didn't stop there. These risky loans were bundled into mortgage-backed securities, or MBS, which were sold to investors worldwide. The idea was that spreading the risk would minimize it, but in reality, it created a fragile house of cards. If a few of these loans defaulted, the entire structure could collapse. The housing market bubble grew, and everyone from lenders to investors kept betting on it. It seemed like easy money, but under the surface, there was a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. The crisis unfolds.
See, people that stayed plugged into the news and the tempo of the markets, they could have liquidated some of their holdings to avoid that drastic shift in the change of price. But a lot of people that weren't aware, they got burnt. Another example of how current events can impact the stock market is the Greek debt crisis. The Greek debt crisis began in 2009 and it lasted for several years. And during this time, the stock market in Greece, when it crashed, a ton of investors pulled their money out of different types of Greek stocks and bonds. And this is because investors were worried that Greece would basically default on all of its current debts that it was holding. But what it did is it left many people who maintained those positions in a horrible spot because they basically were late to the party.
In 2007, that time bomb went off. The housing bubble burst, and the impact was massive. What started as a few bad loans spiraled into a global financial crisis. Suddenly, houses that were once worth fortunes were now underwater, and many people owed more on their mortgages than their homes were worth. The fallout wasn't limited to homeowners. It affected entire economies. Major financial institutions that were once seen as unshakable began to crumble. Lehman Brothers, one of the giants in investment banking, filed for bankruptcy, the largest in U.S. history. This sent shockwaves through the global markets. Bear Stearns, another major player, narrowly avoided the same fate, being bought by J.P. Morgan Chase for a fraction of its former value. These weren't isolated events, but signs of a much deeper problem. The collapse of these institutions was a clear indicator of systemic failure. Stock markets around the world plummeted, erasing years of growth in just months. Banks stopped lending to each other because trust had evaporated, freezing the gears of the global economy. In response, governments had to step in, taking drastic actions to prevent a total collapse. The world watched as leaders scrambled to save the financial system. The stakes had never been higher, and it was a race against time to prevent another Great Depression, the response to the crisis. Faced with the potential collapse of the global economy, governments around the world took bold steps. In the United States, the government launched the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. Under TARP, the government bought toxic assets and equity from financial institutions to keep them afloat. It was a risky move, but the idea was to provide a safety net that would stabilize the financial sector and, by extension, the entire economy. At the same time, the Federal Reserve implemented a policy known as quantitative easing. This involved buying government bonds and other securities to increase the money supply, encouraging lending and investment. Think of it as giving the economy a shot of adrenaline to jumpstart growth and prevent further decline. While these measures were necessary, they weren't without their critics. Many argued that bailing out banks and financial institutions sent the wrong message, essentially rewarding bad behavior. This, they said, created a moral hazard, where companies could take excessive risks without facing the consequences. Additionally, the costs of these bailouts and stimulus packages were staggering, leading to increased government debt. This burden would fall on future generations, raising concerns about the long-term sustainability of such interventions. Despite these controversies, the actions taken during the crisis did prevent a complete economic meltdown, but they didn't solve the underlying problems that led to the crisis in the first place. The financial system was stabilized, but the foundation remained shaky. As we moved forward, it became clear that while the immediate crisis was averted, the world economy was still vulnerable. The Aftermath and Unanswered Questions.
I didn't really learn any new lessons in 2008 or 9. I had emphasized to me some of the things that I'd always believed, that you do need somebody who can say, well, do whatever it takes. The U.S. government had to do the right things, not perfect things, but generally the right things, starting in September, and they did a fantastic job, actually, getting the train back on the tracks. There was still damage for a long period thereafter, but it was really important to have fast action at that time. And we were very fortunate we had the leaders we did. If we'd had people who waited for all the information to be right, or for committees to work, or that sort of thing, it would have been far, far worse.
The aftermath of the 2008 crisis left the world grappling with several unresolved issues. The crisis exposed deep flaws in the financial system, many of which remain unaddressed. One of the most obvious legacies of the crisis is the massive increase in government debt. In their efforts to stave off a total collapse, governments around the world borrowed heavily, pumping money into their economies. This helped in the short term, but the long-term effects are still being felt. Another major consequence is the widening wealth gap. The financial crisis hit the poorest the hardest, while the wealthiest managed to weather the storm relatively unscathed. This has led to growing inequality, with the rich getting richer and the poor falling further behind. It's a stark reminder of how economic downturns disproportionately affect those with the least resources. Perhaps the most concerning question, though, is whether we've truly fixed the problems that caused the crisis. Have the regulations and reforms put in place since 2008 been enough to prevent a repeat, or have we just set ourselves up for another, even bigger crisis down the line? Some experts believe that the measures taken were more like a bandage than a cure, addressing symptoms without tackling the root causes. If that's the case, we might just be postponing the inevitable. As we continue to navigate these uncertain times, it's crucial that we learn from the past. The financial crisis of 2008 was a wake-up call, highlighting the vulnerabilities in our economic system. But it's up to us to make sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes. By understanding what went wrong and making the necessary changes, we can hopefully build a more resilient financial future. The story of the 2008 financial crisis is a stark reminder of how fragile our economic system can be. While the actions taken at the time helped prevent a total collapse, they didn't fix the underlying problems. As we look to the future, it's clear that the issues that led to the crisis still need to be addressed. We can't afford to ignore the warning signs, hoping that everything will work itself out. Instead, we must be proactive, learning from the past and making the changes necessary to ensure a more stable and fair financial system for everyone. Thanks for joining us on No Money. If you found this video helpful, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our future content. See you next time.